Hey there, folks. It's Javier here. I'm coming to you live here tonight. First of all, I'm Javier Lopez, Javier Blog 28 on YouTube. Tonight, we're going to be discussing this, I guess, if you will, this so-called, ICE protesters raiding a church in Minneapolis. I've been seeing this kind of in the news on and off, and I've been kind of like dodging doing a video on this, or just kind of like hoping this will just pass, but it looks like it's making a lot of rounds in the news, and we're going to address it. And there is actually, I did look into it, and there is actually a lot to unpack here. First of all, I have to give it to Don Lennon. Don Lennon is pretty bold, in directly interviewing the pastor, directly calling out Nicki Minaj for her homophobic slurs against him. I'm very impressed with him, just like in general. He just seems like a person who's just really devout to standing up for what he believes, and also for his Christian faith too, which is, the same Christian faith that I hold, and I admire that about him. So something that's going on is like there's been a lot of rounds in the news by the hard right, by right-wing media, talking about this so-called church invasion, and calling it like an attack on Christians, a persecution of Christians, etc., etc., etc. And we're going to dive into the truth about this and kind of like ease some of the hysteria that's coming from the hard right and just kind of unpack this a little bit. First of all, I'm going to just look into some of the responses from this that happened. Tulsi Gabbard, she caught my attention here by saying that one of the main reasons I left the Democratic Party was because of their hostility toward God and to those who have faith, or in trying to cultivate their love for God. Okay, first of all, that's just not happening. First of all, I'm just going to address Tulsi's little claim here. One of the main reasons I left the Democratic Party was because of their hostility towards God and those who have faith and are trying to cultivate their love for God. First of all, that's just not happening. Anybody that's defending ICE in any way or defending the actions of ICE in any way is in no way, shape, or form cultivating their love for God. That's just not true. And just in general, like continues to go into this Christian persecution complex that is saying that the left, and I've addressed this before, the Democrats and the left are anti-Christianity and anti-religion and Christianity and all that, and are trying to persecute Christians. None of that's true. As I've addressed many times, there's many, many, many Christians on the left, myself included, and Don Lemon included. And we're going to get to Don Lemon in a few minutes. But continuing on this little rant here, there's so-called protesters who try to intimidate and terrorize an innocent women and children and men in the Minneapolis church. She's talking about innocent men, women, and children in the church. Is just another example of hostility toward God and his worshipers. I disagree, but I'll be explaining that later. Such behavior is, she meant to say demonic. I think demoniac. I've never heard that word, so I think she said demonic. That's what I think. And should be condemned by everyone. Again, everyone meaning like people who are automatically taking the right-wing narrative to this and making that the only narrative instead of actually seeing both sides, which I'm going to be discussing both sides in this video. Should be condemned by everyone, and those who are in part those who took part in the intimidation tactic should be held accountable. Well, we'll get to the possibility of anybody being held accountable for the so-called invasion of the church, but at the same time, I disagree with the narrative she's trying to push. And continuing on, there is a lot of stuff going on in the news about like all this stuff. Anti-ICE mob targets church from Fox News, illegally disrupts church protest. I saw other things calling it like a persecution on Christians, an attack on Christians, and the left mob attacks the left attacks Christians. Don Lemon under fire for anti-ICE mob search. Okay, first of all, one thing I did want to address is that the pastor, and first of all, this doesn't make a difference, but the pastor of this church was actually involved with ICE. I think he was an ICE agent of some sort or something like that. And the moral question of this, and I'm just throwing this in the air real quick. The moral question of whether an ICE agent should be a pastor should be an ICE agent also. I disagree personally. I don't believe that a pastor should be an ICE agent. I think that those two are very contradictory to each other. And the truth is that the pastor was an ICE agent. We're going to now play a video of this so-called storming. And we're also going to be playing Don Lennon's interview with the pastor. And we're going to be discussing a little bit. So here's the video of what happened. And we're going to discuss this. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop it there. You basically saw it. It was a protest. Yes, they did go into the church, which is true. I will grant that it's true. However, there was no violence. The right likes to say that like the left are all about violence. They did go into the church. Granted, we can talk about the moral question about them entering that church, for those purposes. But at the same time, we can also tackle the moral question about what a better place to call for justice for a woman that lost her lives than in a church. And I do believe that, pastors who are actually preaching Christianity, they're actually preaching Christ, should actually be calling for justice for Renee Good, should actually be, speaking out against ICE and speaking out against, the atrocities that ICE is doing. So granted, I do believe that that is the right thing to do and that what a better place to do that in a church. However, where I will disagree is I don't think that they should have invaded the church like that. So I don't agree with the concept of them invading the church like that. I will grant that. I don't think that was right to do. However, I think that the message was right, calling for justice for Renee Good and calling for justice against the atrocities against, ICE, and also, calling out directly calling out the pastor for being involved in ICE. And I think that those are the right messages. The chants that we're doing were the right chants, and the protesting they were doing was the right thing to do, and the protest was right to happen. And I agree with the protest, and I agree with the message of the protest. However, where I disagree is the actual entry and violation of the church service. But no matter what right-wing media will tell you, there was zero violence in here. And that's just what it was. And yes, again, the pastor was a member of ICE. We're going to now play Don Lennon's interview with the pastor, and I'm also going to read it to you guys, and we're going to discuss it a little bit.
What do you think of this?
I mean, this is unacceptable. It's shameful. It's shameful to interrupt a public gathering of Christians in worship. So,
But there were folks who
I have to take care of my flock.
Okay, but listen, we live there's a constitution and a First Amendment to freedom of speech and freedom to assemble and protest.
We're here to worship. We're here to worship Jesus because that's the hope of these cities. That's the hope of the world is Jesus Christ.
I want to be very respectful. Please don't push me, though.
We're here to worship Jesus. Yes. That's why we're here. Yes. Okay, that's why we're here. Okay. That's what we're about.
Don't you think Jesus would be understanding
we're about
love these folks?
We're about spreading the love of Jesus.
But did you try to talk to them as a
no
Christian?
one is willing to talk.
Okay.
I have to take care of my church and my family, so I asked that you actually would also leave this building.
You don't want us to chronicle what happened?
You're here to worship.
I'm always worship. I'm a Christian.
We're here to worship. We're here to worship. Okay.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
I do agree at the same time. Don Lennon's message was correct in the sense that, yes, Don Lennon is a Christian. And Don Lennon, gave the right message in interviewing the pastor. Please go on. And in interviewing the pastor, Don Lemon did give the right message. At the same time, hold on, I'm live right now, please.
Okay, just sign the card, okay? We're ready.
Hold on.
We're gonna go together.
All right. So Don Lennon, he interviewed the pastor. And I do agree, Don Lennon is showing that, he's showing Christianity. He's like, Jesus loves these folks. Jesus loves these immigrants, these protesters, etc., etc. And meanwhile, the pastor was just like, oh, we're just here to worship Jesus, worship Jesus. Meanwhile, at the same time, we need to remember that this pastor is actually himself an ICE agent. This pastor is himself like this pastor is himself like involved with ICE, involved with ICE agent, involved with ICE atrocities, etc., etc. And yet he's over there, proclaiming, oh, we're here to worship Jesus, we're here to worship Jesus. Well, if he was there to worship Jesus, he wouldn't be at all involved in that. He would be doing in my opinion, in my humble opinion, he would be, part of the protest. He would be speaking out against the atrocities of ICE, and he would be agreeing with Don Lennon. And this is a big issue personally that I have with evangelicals. This is a big issue personally that I actually have with evangelicals, because they're big on like worship Jesus, worship Jesus, worship Jesus. Meanwhile, they oppose, the stands for justice that Christ would call us to stand for. And that it's extremely, extremely, extremely hypocritical. The stand for justice for the marginalized, for those that need health care, for the LGBT community, for the immigrants and the migrants, etc., etc., etc. They're opposed to all of that. And they prop up and idolize a guy like Charlie Kirk and turn him into the sacred Christian martyr. And there's so much wrong with that. Like when I was over there at the Charlie Kirk Memorial Service rally, and I'm just going to get sidetracked really, really briefly. When I was over at the Charlie Kirk Memorial Service rally, yeah, there was all this talk about worshiping Jesus and worshiping Jesus and worshiping Jesus, but I didn't feel it was Christ-centered at all. I didn't feel it was Christ-centered because these are the same people that are demonizing the left, that are demonizing the Democrats, that are demonizing marginalized communities and trans people, LGBT people, migrants, immigrants, the vulnerable, the oppressed, etc., etc. The people that Jesus would have called us to stand up for and fight for and speak out for justice for. And meanwhile, they're propping up and martyrizing a guy like Charlie Kirk. So I don't see, it doesn't matter how much worshiping Jesus conservative right-wing evangelicals are doing. If I don't see that reflected in their action, in their stand for the marginalized and the oppressed and the migrant and the LGBT, etc., etc., if I don't see that in them, I don't take that seriously. And that is actually a bad testimony on your reflection of Christ. It doesn't matter like this guy right here, this guy, he is an ICE guy. He's part of ICE. He is the pastor of a church and he is part of ICE. And that's why I kept seeing these memes about like, you can't be this, you can't, that's why I kept seeing these memes like, you can't be a pastor of a church and also like a member and part of ICE, and those memes are absolutely, in my opinion, those memes are absolutely correct. There's a meme right here about, let's say, Jesus like cleansing the temple, whereas the pastor of the church is ICE. It reminds me of where in the Bible, whereas it reminds me of in the Bible where Jesus overturned the tables in the temple and the religious Pharisees, condemned him for doing that. And that's just exactly pretty much what it was. At the end of the day, it's like ICE does not belong leading churches. ICE agents don't belong leading churches. ICE agents are supposed to be standing for the marginalized, standing for the migrants, standing for, the poor and underclass and all these people, those in need of health care, all these people, and the LGBT too. And if I see this, I don't see Christianity in that, no matter how much they say they worship Jesus. So, it's like at the end of the day, it's like an ICE agent leading the church. Do you think that Jesus would be overturning the stuff like he did in the temple, if you will? And there was another video that actually caught my attention. There was another video that caught my attention of a pastor that was doing just that. A black pastor, actually. And let me remind you guys real quick, just briefly, I want to remind you guys that, give me 1 second. I got a little sidetracked. Let me just briefly remind you guys that, how many times ICE has gone into churches and taken people out of churches. How many times has ICE raided churches? It's happened a lot. ICE raids churches just to get the immigrants out and detain them and take them away. You know, for churches that are trying to hide and protect migrants, vulnerable migrants, doing the work of Christ and protect them from the ICE agents, those churches are raided by ICE. So more just massive right-wing hypocrisy there, which is absolutely sickening and disgusting. I want to show you this video real quick of a black pastor, kicking ICE agents out of his church. I'm like, damn, that is really, that seems to be more like what Jesus would do than anything. Here it is. Give me a second, you know.
Out! Get out of my church! Sir? No! Not today! And not on this church! I don't know what God you worship. Maybe an orange one, but my God, out! Get out of my church! Sir? No! Not today!
God, bravo. God bless that pastor. God bless that pastor. And, you know, at the end of the day, that just seems to me like more what Jesus would do than anything. So, let's just see what else I have for you over here. You know, we already discussed the responses. We discussed Tulsi Gabbard. We discussed, how the right is trying to paint this as like a persecution of Christians. And it's just so dishonest and just so full of lies and deception. And it's just so sad how the weak mind is manipulated into believing this. It's so pathetically sad. We've already shown you Don Layman's interview, which I actually wanted to read out really briefly. Just real quick. Pastor, this is unacceptable. It's shameful. It's shameful to interrupt a public gathering of Christians in worship. Again, it's not for me to judge people's hearts. It's not for me to judge people's hearts. I do a lot of things that are not Christian myself because I am a sinner. But anybody who's in Christian worship and you know, supporting ICE and supporting the detaining of immigrants and especially hypocritically the detaining of immigrants in churches, you know, it's just like, how can they, you know, I don't personally call that Christians in worship, but it's not for me to judge their hearts at the end of the day. Lemon says, but there are folks who also, pastor says, I have to take care of my flock and family. Lemon, okay, but listen, there is a Constitution, a First Amendment. Yeah, this is Lemon here. He's correct. Okay, but listen, there is a Constitution, and the First Amendment is freedom of speech and freedom to assemble and protest. That is correct. Okay, Lemon is correct on that, but in the sense of invading the church, he is in the wrong. I will confess that. Lemon, I'm going to be very respectful. Please don't, wait a minute. The pastor, we are here to worship. We are here to worship Jesus because that is the hope of these cities. That is the hope of the world is Jesus Christ. That's true. I agree with the pastor. Jesus is the hope of the cities. Jesus is the hope of the world. But for that to happen, Jesus needs to be reflected in people, and it's not reflecting in the pastors that are supporting ICE agents or even being part of ICE. That's not reflecting Jesus. So he's one to talk about that, but you know, I at the same time, I got my own sins. I know those are some of his sins. I got my own sins. So whatever, it is what it is. Lemon, I'm going to be very respectful. Please don't push me though. We're here to worship Jesus. He kept emphasizing worshiping Jesus. That's why we're here. And that's what we're about. You know, like, and I've already explained to you about my views about like how the evangelicals love to throw their hands in the air and worship, while at the same time supporting, attacking the vulnerable, the migrant, the LGBT, the immigrant, the in need of health care, you know, support all the, you know, unapologetically support voting and electing Republicans and demonizing the Democrats as the left and lying about them. So it's just like, no Jesus there, no matter how much they worship. We're here to worship Jesus. That's why we're here. What do you think Jesus would be understanding and love these folks? Yes, I do think Jesus would be understanding and love these folks because, and once again, I agree with the message they were shouting in the church. Justice for Renee Good. ICE out, ICE out. You know, I agree with the message, and I think that Christians should be doing that. That's what Christians should be doing. You know, speaking out against ICE and speaking to get ICE out of churches, you know, and speaking just to get like, you know, to defend the marginalized and the poor and the immigrant. You know, that's what Christians should be doing. not defending, federal agents that are going in, and like an army of federal agents going in and rounding people up inside and including churches. I can't stress that enough. That is the biggest piece of this hypocrisy. That is the biggest piece of this hypocrisy, is the fact that, churches are being disrupted. Churches are being raided by ICE. Do you know how many times it has happened? Churches raided by ICE just to round up migrants. ICE raids churches. Churches that are actually following Jesus, More churches are suing ICE. Yeah, this is like, look at this. I want to emphasize this more than anything. More churches are suing ICE over arrests in places of worship. Congregations have gone underground. That is so sad. Now that, in my opinion, that's Christian persecution. That's Christian persecution. When ICE is raiding churches, and then they're crying about some protesters entering a church, but at the same time, when ICE is raiding churches, that is Christian persecution right there. Raiding churches to round up migrants and immigrants, that's Christian persecution. And it's just, that is the biggest blunt of hypocrisy that I've ever seen in this whole, protesters raid a church scenario that the right is screaming about. That is the biggest blunt of hypocrisy there. And meanwhile, we got ICE constantly raiding churches to capture immigrants. That is just it's so evil. It's evil. That's what I'm going to call it. It's evil.
Facts.
Yeah, it is. And I'll be with you guys pretty soon, I know. But so that's what's going on. And so it's just, all this talk about the pastor talking about worshiping Jesus, but he condones this. It's a mess. We're supposed to understand and love these folks. Yeah, so of course Jesus would understand and love these folks. I agree with him. And then the pastor, again, Pharisee, we're about spreading the love of Jesus. He's just being robotic here again. We're here to worship Jesus. We're here to worship Jesus. We're here to worship Jesus. But you're not reflecting him, dude. You're not reflecting him. No one is going to talk. Okay, a lemon, I'm always worshiping. I'm a Christian. And I believe that. There's a lot of attacks on Lemon for being gay, but I believe he's a Christian. So, well, we're here to worship. Okay, the pastor's just being robotic. Okay, thank you very much. Interview ends. So, I've already explained to you, the biggest just blunt of hypocrisy, how ICE is raiding churches all the time, barely makes the news, but once those protesters get into the church, I didn't quite agree with the idea of them going into the church. I didn't quite agree with that. But at the same time, it just exposes all the hypocrisy about, constantly, about how, because ICE is the one that's constantly going into churches and taking immigrants and arresting them. And then Nicki Minaj gets involved and makes a homophobic slur against Don Lennon, So Don Lennon, fires back against this. I did want to play this real quick.
It's lemon.
Lemon, yeah, lemon.
I'm just saying lemon.
People have been asking me about responding to Nicki Minaj's unhinged homophobic tweet about me. I usually don't respond to this stuff, but let me just say this. Nicki Minaj, stop talking about shit for which you know nothing about. This is you're out of your depth, by the way, and you are a homophobic bigot. You don't care about African Americans. You're not an African American. From what I know, you are reportedly an undocumented citizen, so you should be deported under Donald Trump's rules. And the other thing is that your family members, you have one family member who is reportedly a sex offender, the other family member, your husband or whatever, a sex offender is your husband, and one of them is reportedly a pedophile. And you have nerve to talk about me and what you think that I do? Nicki Minaj, get a life. Stop being a pick-me. You should have put a pick-me doll on that damn tweet instead of a Chucky doll, because you are nothing but a pick-me. And I choose not to pick you. And so should black people and so should gay people. Shouldn't buy your music. Clock that. So people have been
Wow.
asking me about...
So, very bold take. And, I've also noticed, first of all, I commend Don Lennon for his take on calling out Nicki Minaj for her making a homophobic slur and attacking him for his involvement in the entry of that church, if you will. But at the same time, I also want to emphasize that there's a lot of evangelicals out there, right-wing evangelicals out there, that in response to this church invasion of, of ICE, a lot of them have been attacking Don Lemon because of his sexuality. This is their response to that. This just shows that they don't have anything else to say, so they're going to resort to attacking Don Lemon because of his sexuality. Nicki Minaj, who I have defended in the past, I have defended her. I said it's awesome that she's trying to leave the celebrity industry and get closer to God, and I stand by that. I want to see more celebrities come out of that celebrity industry and find Christ and find God. But at the same time, her embrace of Turning Point USA and Trump and right-wingism and all that stuff, that part I don't agree with. But it's a shame that she is moving in that direction. I mean, it's a shame that she is moving in that direction, with the hard right, even to the point where she's now making homophobic slurs. And it's a double shame that there's a lot of pastors, if you will, or right-wing evangelicals that are now attacking Don Lemon over this church issue, over this church thing, over his sexuality, because they got nothing else to attack him about. And it's getting really ugly, and it's just disgusting. Anyways, I guess that's my final take on this. There was just so much to unpack here. The hypocrisy, the ICE raiding churches. Meanwhile, they're constantly worshiping Jesus and all that stuff. At the same time, the ICE is raiding churches, and they freak out about some protesters entering. And I just give it to Don Lemon. He just took some very bold takes on this, interviewing that pastor, directly interviewing and confronting that pastor, And at the same time, I agreed with the message that they were chanting in the church, justice for Renee Good and, and ICE out, ICE out. I agree that, Christians should be doing that message. The only part I disagree with, and I'm going to be honest with you. I already said this earlier in the video, is the actual fact that they, went and raided that church, if you will. I don't think I'm quite on board with that, but at the same time, it is true that Jesus, overturned the stuff in the temple and all that. It's just, there was a lot to unpack, a lot of hypocrisy, a lot of thoughts on this. I appreciate, if you guys like, subscribe and share, and just watch I appreciate you guys. Feel free to leave your thoughts. Thank you for watching. Take care. This is Javier.